The real origins of terrorism. How the 19th and 20th century laid the ideological foundation for every terrorist organization today. Part 1. Breaking the moral high ground and exposing the propaganda war machine. How did terrorism get injected into Islam? This is a question that is asked by military leaders, politicians, and Muslims alike. Now, the purpose of these next few videos will be to show that the ideology of terrorism was foreign to Islam and was only introduced to the Muslim world over the past century. Terrorism, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Now, even though to most this might appear to be a perfectly fine definition, but what we've witnessed over the years is that the term terrorism or terrorist has been vague enough to be exploited by just and oppressive nations alike. So a better definition would be any person or group who purposely targets innocent civilians for political or ideological ends. And the important point to focus on is innocent civilians, because many times the media will blur the lines between what is considered a civilian and an armed soldier. Which, if that were the case, then every nation that took part in the major wars of the past century would then be guilty of terrorism. But even when that is the case, we've seen many incidents where leaders and governments have completely removed the concept of morality from their conflicts. This concept cannot be clearer than what happened during World War II, where the Allied forces and Nazi Germany both purposely targeted civilian populations during the war. So the Allied nations, for instance, targeted the cities of Hamburg and Dresden, dropping thousands of bombs over the course of just a few years, killing a total of 67,000 civilians. And let us not forget the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which with only 2 atomic bombs killed at least 130,000 civilians.
The Nazis, on the other hand, have many examples of this, the most famous of which came to be known as the Blitz, where from 1940 to 1941, the Nazis bombed mercilessly the city of London,
which destroyed an estimated 1 million homes and killed a total of 40,000 civilians. And just for context, here's a map taken from bombsite.org, where they provide a red dot to indicate each area in London that was hit during the bombing campaign by the Nazis. So here we're zoomed into Buckingham Palace. And then when we zoom out a little bit, we see how close each bomb was in the city block or vicinity. And then when we zoom out completely, we begin to understand just how devastating the bombing campaign really was. Now keep in mind that each bomb being dropped from these planes are basically the equivalent of a suicide bomber, meaning that both the pilot and the terrorist know that they are going to be targeting innocent civilians. Thus, both must hold a similar ideology that helps them justify their actions.
Throughout the history of human civilization, man has consistently struggled with the meaning of what is truly right and wrong. From the ancient Egyptians, who not only believed that the ideas of moral truth and justice was a religious obligation, but that the concept was so important it became personified in one of their goddesses, Ma'at. This continued down the line to the philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, who created the foundations of philosophical ethics and the idea of the highest good, which later would come to be known as summum bonum, a term coined by the Roman philosopher Cicero in the 1st century BCE.
This in turn led to an English philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham to come up with the concept of utilitarianism, which is the moral theory that good and bad decisions can only be judged by the net happiness each produces. This concept would later be built upon by John Stuart Mill, who, in 1863, wrote a book entitled Utilitarianism, which is considered one of the most influential texts in the history of philosophy. Utilitarianism, which later would come under the general category of consequentialism, is the theory that one should judge an action or decision based on the ends or consequences, and that the means or methods are completely irrelevant to the overall judgment. This would later come to be known in the modern vernacular as the ends justifies the means. In utilitarianism, though, there are times where instead of having to choose what causes the most happiness, you're left in a situation where you're facing two negative scenarios where you have to choose what causes the least sadness. This would come to be known in our modern vernacular as the lesser of two evils. There are many situations where a person can be presented with such a problem. One such scenario is presented in a famous thought experiment known as the trolley problem. The scenario goes like this. There's a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks. Some distance ahead of the trolley, there are 5 people tied down on one track and a single person on the other. At the time, you just so happen to be standing next to the lever which can determine which track the trolley will go down and who it essentially kills. So you're left with a moral dilemma here. Do you choose to pull the lever and have the trolley kill only one person, or do you leave it and allow the trolley to kill 5 people? Utilitarianism would argue that not only should you choose the one person to be killed, but that it would be morally wrong not to. Now the problem with the theory is that it assumes we live in an egalitarian society where everyone is viewed as equal, and it ignores such trends like nationalism, tribalism, racism, prejudice, and ideological differences. So the man at the lever, depending on his loyalties, could actually view the single person as being more important than the group of people. And it is this vulnerability that extremists and nationalists exploit, where through differences and similarities, they try to raise and lower another person's worth. It was this method, for instance, that was employed when the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the time, to invade Japan with ground troops would have taken months and cost tens of thousands of lives. So instead, they believed dropping 2 atomic bombs, which would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese, was the lesser of two evils. This is because they believed the American soldiers' lives were worth more than the Japanese civilian lives. This is what I like to call unethical utilitarianism, where nations, groups, parties, and various ideologies use their differences to raise or lower the worth of another person. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant had foreseen this problem previously in the 18th century and came up with a theory known as the categorical imperative, where Kant explained that the validity of an action can be judged by if it can be universally applied to all people at all times. Which means, whenever a person or nation adopts a certain policy, what they are initially saying is that this can be adopted by all people and all nations. So take for instance the US drone program, which has been estimated to have a 90% civilian death rate. Now even though pseudo-philosophers like Sam Harris would claim that the actions of the US are morally upright since they don't intend on targeting civilians like terrorists do, the categorical imperative would state that by the US doing such an action, that they are insinuating that any other state could do the same to them so long as they intend to target criminals and not innocent civilians. And if innocents were to die, then up to a 90% casualty rate would be acceptable. But of course, the US and any other first world nation would never accept such actions on their soil. So like what we saw with the concept of unethical utilitarianism, here we also have what I like to call a selective categorical imperative. And let's be brutally honest. Right now, every single one of the 9 nations who currently have nuclear weapons are potential terrorist states. Just to help put things into perspective, the United States' largest nuke, the 9-megaton W-53, could kill up to 4 million people per missile. That is the equivalent of 40,000 suicide bombers, who usually kill an average of 100 people per attack, and or 1,333 9/11 attacks. And due to the strategic theory of nuclear deterrence, which is known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction, every elected leader within these countries take office knowing full well that one day they might be called to launch a nuke, which would result in the death of millions of innocent people. And the worst thing about such weapons is that those who weren't fortunate enough to die right away and were on the outer limits of the blast will be cursed with a slow and agonizing death. Some will have their skin peel off,
if it wasn't already ripped off from the initial blast, while some will swell up due to burns and trauma, while others will rot from the inside out due to radiation poisoning. All of which is far worse and crueler than any terrorist beheading we've seen. And this would be done by clean-cut politicians in expensive suits rather than bearded terrorists in turbans. Now, under one of the protocols of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it is illegal to target civilian populations or civilian facilities such as dams, electronic grids, places of worship, etc. In military doctrine, and specifically nuclear warfare, these are known as counter-value targets. The term value here is used because you're threatening something of personal value instead of strategic or military value to your enemy. Counter-force targets, on the other hand, are any and all people, objects, and facilities connected with the military. And anything that falls under this category is 100% a valid target under international law. The scary thing is, even though counter-value targets are illegal in theory, every Western nation reserves the right to use such targeting if nuclear warfare were to ever break out. Especially in terms of second strike retaliation, meaning that if any nation had employed counter-value tactics and targeted their cities, the nation would respond in the same manner. And people seem to forget that the United States and the Soviet Union on a number of occasions almost had an all-out nuclear war, one in which civilian and military targets would all be considered one and the same. And since the beginning of the Cold War in the 1950s, it's almost as if the rest of the world had been held hostage as these two nations battle it out for power. Most of which were done using satellite states, which started in Europe, but then quickly moved down to third world countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And even though the Cold War had officially ended in 1991, the US and other nuclear nations like Russia and China still continue to compete for influence throughout the globe. And with the right wing on the rise in the United States and across Europe, we're beginning to hear once again the same rhetoric we heard during the Cold War. Theresa May's party, for instance, said that they wouldn't rule out a nuclear first strike under extreme circumstances. Meaning that now the conversation about nuclear weapons has shifted from only being a last resort deterrent to a viable military option under extreme circumstances. What exact circumstances those are, only they know. What we do know is that when it comes to military strategy, and especially nuclear warfare, ethics and morality are completely separated from the discussion. And whether they want to admit it or not, all 9 nuclear powers who use their weapons as a threat are theoretically no different than a suicide bomber. Both essentially are saying to the world, if I lose, I'm taking everyone with me. Which, as stated before, is the core concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, which is an acronym that perfectly describes these superpowers. So for instance, if the Soviet Union had invaded the United Kingdom like the United States did to Iraq, and after occupying the country began arresting or assassinating heads of state, in theory, as a last resort, the UK military could launch a nuke at Russia in retaliation, be it by air, land, or sea. Now I ask you, is this not the exact same logic used by terrorist organizations? And if we were to break down the language of these two groups in its most basic and primal form, we see them saying that essentially under the most desperate circumstances, we'll use any means necessary to deter the enemy, which could possibly occur in a full-blown incursion, an overwhelming assassination campaign of heads of state, or in retaliation to a nuclear first strike. So to help put things into perspective, let's say the United States and Russia decided to start a nuclear war. What would such a scenario look like? To help us visualize this, we'll be using an interactive map created by Alex Willerstein called Nuke Map, which can be found at the address below. So if the US, for instance, were to launch a nuke into the heart of Moscow using the B-83, which is 1.2 megatons and is the most common nuke in the US arsenal, one missile would kill almost 1.4 million people and would injure another 4 million. And let's say Russia decided to respond, targeting New York with their nuke called the SS-25, which is an 800 kiloton missile.
This would result in almost 1.6 million people dying and another 3 million being injured.
And need I remind the viewers that the United States has a stockpile of 6,800 nuclear warheads, while Russia has 7,000? And if the two nations ever did go to war, scientists believe that it would only take 100 nukes, with the explosive force of the Hiroshima bombing, to throw the whole world into a nuclear winter for years, which in turn would create widespread famine across the globe. And again, this deterrent threat is taking place as we speak. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, politicians in Western democracies are threatening our very existence, just like a terrorist organization would. The only difference is, one group can only kill a few thousand people at a time, while the other could kill millions at a time. Oh, and let us not forget that it was a man in a suit who dropped not one, but 2 atomic bombs on a civilian population, which, if history were written by anyone other than Western powers, would be considered the largest and most deadly terrorist attack in history. Now, the reason why I'm saying all this is because I want the viewers to understand that there's a difference between the morality of the general public, which is for the most part good, just, and upright, and the morality of the military and their strategists. Michael Walzer, the author of the famous book Just and Unjust Wars, reiterated this point at his lecture at Westmount College in 2013, saying, "War, I want to argue, isn't a case to which the law of everyday morality can be applied. The practice of war has been argued about and reflected on over the centuries, and it has its own law and even its own morality. That morality is usually laid out in what is known as just war theory, which is a 3-stage process of what would constitute a just war. The first being jus ad bellum, a pre-war state where one presents justification to go to war. The second being jus in bello, which is the rules of engagement while in war. And finally, jus post bellum, which is a post-war state where the winning side usually decides how to deal with the losing side. Now, each of these states must be based on proportionality. The first being the choice to begin a war based upon the proportion of the perceived threat. The second being the choice how to fight the war based upon the proportion of the perceived threat. The third being the choice of how to punish based upon the proportion of the perceived crimes committed. The problem with the issue of proportionality, as you might have noticed, is that it's based upon perception, which means it's susceptible to manipulation, over-exaggeration, general bias, and propaganda. Now, just war theory is utilitarian at its core, but instead of one decision between 2 choices, as we saw with the trolley problem mentioned before, we have 2 decisions between 4 problems. One being on whether to enter war or not, and the other happens after war has begun, and is the decision on whether to enter into peace or not. Now, the way I like to look at how these 2 decisions are made is like having 2 scales to weigh out the utilitarian option. So war itself is naturally a difficult decision, and naturally we view peace as a preferable option. During the pre-war stage, what happens though is that politicians and military personnel will attempt to build arguments, which will be represented as smaller counterweights labeled threat. So they build their case until eventually their arguments outweigh the weight of peace, which then gives them justification to go to war. The problem is that these various threats are based upon perception, and unless they are backed by logic, reasoning, and facts, the threats in question could easily be inflated and made to appear bigger and heavier than they really are. Not to mention that when no one is looking, some people sneak in their own biases and ulterior motives to tip the scales as well. But once the threat outweighs the weight of peace, a nation will usually go to war. So once they've made that shift, now the reasons for entering war need to be taken and be used as a weighing factor as to when to exit the war, or to enter into peace. To achieve this, the warring nation will need to remove the threats until the weight of peace is heavier than the threats posed. Now here is what I believe are 3 of the core reasons why we've so easily entered into conflicts in the 20th and 21st century. In relation to Western nations, after World War II and the Cold War, every threat was viewed through the lens of a possible nuclear war. As for the Israelis, after the previous persecution of the Jewish people in Europe and the horrors of World War II, every threat was viewed through the lens of a possible Holocaust. And as for the Muslim and Arab states, After experiencing Western imperialism and the destruction of Palestine, every threat was viewed through the lens of a possible occupation and expulsion of the people. And the scary thing is, each threat is also weighed against the concept of total war, which is also known as hard war, or in terms of nuclear warfare, counter-value targeting, where not only is peace lifted when war begins, but also our morals, values, and religious convictions. So for example, as we discussed previously, a nuclear strike against a civilian population would be enough to tip the scales into total war, as would complete conquest, genocide, the use of chemical weapons, or in relation to fascist governments, bigotry, racism, and over-exaggerated threats. Now, whether it's normal war, where only military objects are targeted, or total war, where all bets are off, there's a major vulnerability where the supposed threat can be influenced by propaganda from militants and tyrannical governments alike, where they use fear and rhetoric to make the threats appear larger than they really are, so as to trick the population into war. And the problem is that if the purpose of entry into war was inflated, so will be the purpose to exit war. And also, when the threats are based upon over-exaggerated perceptions, then that could create a recipe for perpetual war. Now, even though over the past 2,000 years there has been a number of occasions where total war methods were employed, like for instance the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, where whole towns and villages were completely destroyed, but the collective brutality that we've witnessed over the past century, we must admit, is completely unparalleled throughout human history. For example, the top 3 deadliest dictators who employed a strategy of total war saw death tolls unlike anything the world has ever witnessed, with Mao killing an estimated 75 million people, Stalin killing an estimated 62 million people, and Hitler killing an estimated 20 million people. Now, the purpose behind this video is to lay down the sociological and philosophical foundations of the human condition, that despite whatever ideology mankind follows, we will always have a percentage of our population who will inevitably turn to violence, crime, and yes, even terrorism. And despite the amount of a nation's wealth, education, and culture, their citizens are still susceptible to turning to violence given the right circumstances. So over the next few videos, I'm going to be presenting the argument that terrorism as a method of war and philosophy was introduced to the Muslim world in the 20th century, and was regrettably adopted by some due to the environment at the time, rather than the recommendations of the religious texts. And that the recipe for creating a terrorist organization has so many other external factors involved in the process that even if you were to completely remove religion from the equation, that it is quite possible that you will still have the exact same results that we are witnessing today around the globe.
Written and produced by Simply Sira. Visit us at our website at simplysira.com or follow us on social media. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.